Before I tell you how my father tried to let me die for money, I want to ask you something that has kept me awake at night. If your child were dying, would you think about their life? Or about the money you'd gain if they didn't survive? Because my father made his choice so quickly, so casually, that the doctors in the room froze in disbelief. He looked at my unconscious body, looked at the surgical estimate, and said, "Let her pass. We're not paying for that." I wasn't supposed to hear those words. I wasn't supposed to remember, but trauma has a strange way of recording everything. My name is Isabella Hayes. I'm 30 years old, and 3 months ago I woke up from a coma that should have killed me. The only reason I survived was because a nurse, who believed something didn't add up, called my attorney instead of obeying the DNR order my father insisted on. And the moment I opened my eyes, I didn't confront him. No, I prepared something far more devastating. A plan that would dismantle everything he had built for 40 years and expose the truth behind the Has Foundation, the glamorous charity that wasn't a charity at all. But before I get into any of that, please subscribe if you enjoy true stories filled with betrayal, justice, and twists that prove money can bring out the darkest parts of people. Now, let me take you back to the start. 3 months before the accident, I sat in a boardroom overlooking downtown Chicago, listening to my father explain again why the foundation needed my signature. The Hayes Foundation for Children's Wellness sounded noble, but the line items on the financial reports didn't match anything charitable. Millions were flowing into educational initiatives that didn't exist, research projects that had no publications, and community outreach that nobody in the community had ever heard of. I pushed the paperwork back across the table. These expenses don't match any verified program. Dad, I can't sign off on this. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled, eyes cold. You don't need to understand the accounting, Isabella. Just sign. This is how philanthropy works. No, I said. This is how laundering works. That was the first crack in the facade, his expression tightening, jaw clenching, the mask slipping. You're too naive for this family, he said. Just like your mother. My mother, the woman whose brilliance built our software empire before she died suddenly when I was 24. She left me a $15 million trust, locked until I turned 35. Unless I became medically incapacitated. A clause my mother added after watching my father make decisions that always benefited him more than anything else. My younger sister Lena stared at me from across the room with that tight-lipped look she always wore, caught between fear of our father and fear of losing the lifestyle his money gave her. Her nails tapped anxiously against her phone, each staccato click a reminder of how isolated I'd become at that table. My father continued, "You either support this family or you become a liability." A liability, I whispered. Someone who needs to be managed. The air in the room thinned. I felt it. I know now that was the moment everything began. I didn't quit. I didn't run. I didn't break. I stayed in the company because someone needed to keep a record of what my father was doing. I was the director of compliance, which meant I had access to every contract, donation, licensing agreement, executive bonus, document, every skeleton he thought he had hidden. People asked why I stayed in a place where the CEO, my own father, insulted me openly. During tours, he'd gesture at me and say, "Isabella is only here because her mother had money." She certainly didn't inherit my leadership skills. Board members would laugh politely. Lena would look away. And I stood there, silently absorbing the humiliation. But I stayed because I thought the law could fix this, because I believed evidence mattered, because I believed integrity had power. What I didn't know then was that my father had already decided how to neutralize me long before I built my case.
He didn't need to fire me. He didn't need to silence me.
He just needed me gone. 2 weeks before the accident, I found a file on the server, a confidential legal memo drafted by his private attorney. Subject line: Access to Isabella Hayes Trust Fund Emergency Clause Activation. My chest tightened as I read it. They were discussing the medical incapacitation clause. The memo detailed the process for gaining access to my inheritance if something happened to me. I remember sitting alone in the office, hands trembling, reading every cold clinical line. Not one sentence acknowledged me as a person, only as an asset. That night was the first time I felt afraid of my father. And 2 weeks later, my brakes failed on Lakeshore Drive. A mechanical malfunction, they said. The crash that put me in the coma. The crash that nearly killed me. The crash he expected to finish me. But I survived. When I woke up in the ICU, the world returned in pieces. There were blinding lights, muffled voices, and a pain that felt like it lived deep inside my bones. But the very first clear thing I heard wasn't a doctor's instructions or a nurse calling my name. It was my attorney, Marsha Levin, whispering, "Isabella, don't react, don't move. Just listen." I couldn't move even if I wanted to. My body felt like concrete. My throat burned from the breathing tube, my chest was tightly bandaged, and every single inhale felt like it was scraping against broken glass. Marsha leaned close, her eyes fierce behind her glasses. "Your father signed a DNR. He tried to stop the surgery that saved your life. But the surgeon refused to comply and called me instead." My heart thudded weakly, but my mind sharpened instantly. "He said leaving you would be unfortunate but financially clarifying." I recorded everything. A slow, hollow ache spread across my ribs that had nothing to do with the accident. My father tried to let me die, not out of grief, not out of some twisted sense of medical ethics, but because my death for him was convenient. Because my incapacitation would have released my trust fund. Because a corpse cannot testify. Because a dead daughter makes no trouble. Marsha held up a small recording device. "I have a copy in 3 secure drives. And I already notified 2 federal investigators I trust." I blinked, barely able to process it all. Machines beeped gently around me, pumping, monitoring, keeping me alive. "They think you're still unconscious," she said, her voice low. "And that's the advantage we need." She tucked the device into her coat. "Rest, heal, and when you're ready, we'll burn his empire to the ground." For the next week I pretended. I pretended not to track every whisper outside my door. I pretended I couldn't hear the nurses muttering about the pressure from the Hayes family. I pretended not to hear my sister Lena's forced sobs when she visited, sobs that stopped the very moment she stepped into the hallway. And I pretended not to hear my father's voice, sharp as a blade, asking, "She's still unconscious." "Good, we need to move forward with the trust documents." Every word sliced me open all over again. He never asked about my pain level. He never asked if I was improving. He never asked if I was alive in any meaningful way. Only whether I was useful. Useful dead. Useless alive. A week later, I finally sat up with some stability. A nurse helped adjust my bed, propping pillows behind me and checking my fore. "You're a miracle," she whispered. "I don't care what your father says. You are stronger than any of them." I didn't ask what he'd said. I already knew. That afternoon, Marsha came again, this time with a folder. "This accident wasn't an accident," she said, her tone flat. I'd suspected it, but hearing it said aloud hit me with the force of a physical blow. "We found the car's maintenance records. The brakes were fine 2 weeks ago. But a request was submitted to a shop owned by your father's subsidiary signed off by an employee who suddenly resigned yesterday and left the state." I inhaled sharply, a stabbing pain wrapping around my ribs. Marsha continued, "We don't have enough to prove sabotage yet. But the disappearance is suspicious. And your father called the shop 3 times the morning of the crash." The room seemed to tilt. "He wanted you gone before the board meeting," she said. "He needed you incapacitated to seize your trust and to silence you before you presented evidence of financial misconduct." I closed my eyes. This wasn't just about greed, this was strategy. This was premeditation. This was my father weaponizing our shared blood and biology. Marsha placed her hand over mine. Her touch was firm, grounding. "Do you want justice or revenge?" For the first time in my life, I said the quietest word I'd ever spoken. Both. 3 days later, the hospital released me to a private recovery suite. My movements were slow, carefully practiced. But my mind was fully awake, now alive with plans, possibilities, angles of attack, because my father had no idea I was conscious. No idea I knew. No idea that every word he'd said in that ICU room was preserved forever. He still believed he controlled every single variable. But he didn't know about the one person who was about to destroy him. Me. The first step in dismantling him started with my sister. Lena arrived with a bouquet of flowers so large it nearly blocked her face. Bella, oh my God, you're awake! We were all so worried. Dad hasn't slept since the accident. I almost laughed. Almost. Lena, I said quietly, I need to ask you something important. She paused, her bright smile faltering. Where were you the day of my crash? Her eyes widened. Her fingers tightened around her designer bag. I was working. Why? I looked straight at her. Because the mechanic who approved the brake modification works under your department. Her breath hitched. Bella, I didn't know he'd do anything wrong, Dad said it was a standard inspection. Her words told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't innocent. But she wasn't entirely guilty, either. She was collateral just like me. And I realized something chilling. She feared our father more than she feared being caught. That night, lying in my recovery bed, staring at the city lights outside my window, I began to outline what would become the most precise 24-hour dismantling of a corporate empire Chicago had ever seen. Thanks for watching. If you want to see what happens next, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss part 2. Recovery is a strange mix of pain and clarity. My body felt weak, but my mind felt sharper than it had in years. Every hour, I grew more aware of 2 things. My father wanted me gone, and he believed I was still unconscious. That ignorance would become his undoing. I spent the first 2 days after waking up quietly listening. You know, people reveal their true selves when they think you're not paying attention. And my father, he revealed everything. He showed up twice. Both times, he spoke about me as if I were some sort of business complication. He told a physician that prolonging things would only make the situation financially messier. Can you believe that?
He asked another doctor whether they were comfortable proceeding with the paperwork. His tone was so calm, so cold, almost bored. Not once did he ask if I was in pain.
Not once did he touch my hand. He never even said my name. The nurses, they saw my eyes open, but they didn't tell him. They had seen enough to understand something was deeply wrong. One of them, a kind woman with gentle eyes, even whispered to me, "Whatever you're planning, be smart about it." He's used to getting his way. She was right. He always had. Then my attorney, Marcia Levin, came to see me. It was early on a Wednesday morning. She walked into my recovery suite, closed the blinds, locked the door, and even checked the room for any hidden devices before she spoke. "You don't need to move," she said, her voice firm. "Just listen." She placed a folder on my bedside table and opened her laptop. "Isabella, we have a legal path forward, but we need to act with precision. No confrontations, no accusations. Everything must be handled through official channels." She slid a document toward me. "This is your mother's trust agreement. The clause about incapacitation matters more than ever." My eyes moved slowly across the page, the words blurring slightly. It stated that if I became medically incapacitated, the trust would temporarily transfer to a neutral caregiver chosen by my mother, someone outside the family. And she had chosen Marcia. My throat tightened. It was a strange, bittersweet comfort knowing my mother had predicted the kind of manipulative tactics my father might use, even after she was gone.
He expected the funds to come to him, Marcia said.
He never bothered to read the document fully. Of course he didn't. He always assumed he was in control. "What happens now?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. "We build a case," she explained, "using only legal channels and verifiable financial irregularities. Nothing speculative, nothing emotional. Only facts." She turned the laptop toward me, showing me rows of spreadsheets and financial reports. "I've reviewed the financial activity at your father's foundation and related companies for the last 2 years. There are inconsistencies. Transfers that don't match their stated purposes. Large expenditures recorded without any supporting documentation. These are not conclusions, only red flags. But red flags are all we need to bring in auditors." My heart pounded against my ribs. Finally, a way forward. "A path through the darkness. What do you need from me?" I asked. "For now, patience and silence. Your father cannot know you're conscious until we have everything in place." Later that afternoon, my sister Lena visited. Her mascara was smudged, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. She sat at the foot of my bed, twisting a silver bracelet anxiously around her wrist. Bella, I don't even know where to begin, she whispered. Dad hasn't told me anything directly. But people are talking. There are meetings behind closed doors. He's been making decisions without consulting anyone. Her voice broke and a tear rolled down her cheek. I know I haven't always stood up to him. I know that. But I swear I never imagined we'd get here. I studied her face. She wasn't lying. She wasn't blameless either. Not entirely, but she wasn't a villain. She was just another person living in our father's long, oppressive shadow. Lena, I said slowly, my voice still weak but steady. I need you to be honest with me. Not about him, about you. Are you afraid of what he'd do if he knew you helped me? Her answer was immediate. A choked, quiet yes. The truth of it hung in the sterile air between us, heavy and undeniable. I reached for her hand, my fingers barely brushing hers. You don't need to choose sides yet, I told her. Just don't share anything about my condition. Not with him. Not with anyone. Can you do that for me? She nodded, fresh tears spilling over. I can. That night, when everyone had left and the hallway lights dimmed to a soft glow, I stared at the city skyline through my window. The lights looked so distant, so disconnected from my reality, almost unreal. But the plan forming in my mind felt solid. It felt calm, unshakable. My father had built an empire. He had influence, he had power, he had connections everywhere. But he also had a fatal flaw. He consistently underestimated people who refused to play his game.
He thought he could manipulate me, silence me, erase me from the picture entirely.
But he didn't realize that waking up wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. In part 4, the facade of his empire starts to crack, and this time, every move I make will be by the book. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next part. By the time the weekend arrived, I was stable enough to walk a few careful steps with support. Every movement reminded me of the crash, but the pain was a compass. It reminded me I was alive, and that being alive meant I still had a voice. I needed that voice for what came next. Marcia came to see me early Saturday morning. She had that look she only wore when something monumental was about to happen, focused, calm, and bracing for impact. She set down a folder and said, Isabella, we have our opportunity. Your father is hosting an executive pre-merger review today at Hayes Tower. Only about 15 people are invited. If we move now, we can observe everything without confronting anyone. I raised a brow. Observe? Yes. Legally, she added firmly, we're not accusing him. We're documenting irregularities. That's the only way this is safe and effective. I nodded, relieved. I didn't want a fight, I wanted clarity, truth, transparency. My father had built his reputation on being untouchable. But no one is above accountability, not even him. Marcia handed me a long coat to hide the hospital monitor taped to my ribs, then escorted me to a private medical transport. The hospital agreed to it as long as I was supervised and returned by evening. As we drove downtown, the city shimmered with a cold morning brightness. The skyscrapers felt taller than usual, looming like silent witnesses. When we entered the lobby, no one recognized me under the coat and scarf. Hayes Tower was a monument to my father's ego-glass walls, marble floors, and a lobby full of awards engraved with his name. As we rode the elevator up, Marcia glanced at me. Remember, you're not here to be seen. You're here to understand the scope of what's happening. When the elevator doors opened to the 42nd floor, we stepped into a glass conference hallway. Through the transparent walls, I saw executives gathering, flipping through documents, greeting each other. My father stood at the center of the room, charismatic as always, playing the part of the visionary. His voice carried through the glass. We'll finalize the projections today. Hartford wants full transparency before the shareholders' meeting. We give them exactly what they need and nothing more. Nothing more. That was always his approach. A legal observer sent by external auditors stood in the corner reviewing files. She looked uneasy as my father gestured toward a stack of fiscal reports. These are internal adjustments, he said. Anything too complicated should be summarized. No need to overwhelm the review panel. Overwhelm was his word for hide, Marcia whispered beside me. Look at the dates on the reports they're discussing. I leaned in to read their reflections in the glass. Several line items showed enormous transfers just days before my accident. Others were labeled as operational contingencies, vague enough to be anything. It wasn't proof of wrongdoing yet, but it was enough to justify a deeper review. I whispered to Marcia, "Is this enough to request an oversight inquiry? Combined with the red flags we already documented?" "Yes," she said. "But the most important part is who signs off on these projections. That's your father's Achilles heel." Inside the meeting, one of the executives hesitated. "Robert, these revisions don't match the earlier drafts." My father stiffened. "They're accurate. Circulate them." The executive didn't argue, but the doubt lingered. This time people weren't nodding along blindly. This time there were cracks, tiny but real. While we quietly observed, the elevator dinged behind us. I turned, and for a second, my heart stopped. Lena stepped out. She wasn't dressed in her usual polished, court-ready fashion. Her hair was tied back hastily, and she carried a laptop pressed tightly to her chest. When she saw me, her eyes widened, but she didn't speak. She understood the stakes instantly. She walked over quietly and whispered, I brought something. I don't know if it's useful, but you should have it." Her hands trembled as she opened her laptop and showed us a time-stamped internal memo. It detailed concerns from an employee about financial inconsistencies, concerns that were dismissed without investigation. "This was filed last month," Lena whispered. "Dad made me override the follow-up request." I sucked in a breath. The memo wasn't dramatic. It wasn't incriminating on its own. But combined with everything else, it showed a pattern. A history of avoidance, a refusal to address questions, a systemic culture of silence. Marcia exhaled slowly. "Lena, you have no idea how important this is." Lena's eyes filled. "I just want to do the right thing." The meeting inside grew heated. My father raised his voice, insisting that internal concerns didn't require inclusion in the merger review. One executive pushed back gently, asking if the legal department should sign off. My father waved it off. "My daughter handles compliance. She signs everything I approve." He didn't realize it, but those words were a gift. Marcia looked at me. "That is exactly the issue. He's using your position as a shield." I felt a familiar ache, not physical pain, but the pain of recognizing how long he had controlled the narrative around me. Then something unexpected happened. The external legal observer stepped forward and said, "Mr. Hayes, with respect, any concerns flagged by internal staff should be part of the preliminary review." A silence fell. My father's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to hearing no. He certainly wasn't used to oversight. And that was exactly when Marcia whispered, "This is it. This is where everything starts shifting." We left the tower quietly, unnoticed. And as I was escorted back into the hospital suite later that afternoon, I realized something. My father wasn't untouchable. He was simply unchallenged. And soon, he would face accountability for the first time in his life. The shareholders' meeting was set for Tuesday, March 26th, for my father. It was supposed to be his coronation, the culmination of years of work. For me, it became the day everything finally came into the light. By the time the sun rose, my lawyer Marcia and I had everything ready. We had documented every discrepancy, every questionable timeline. We had Lena's internal memo. And we had the recording from my ICU room. It was all packaged and submitted formally. Not to destroy him, but to protect myself, and to protect the truth. And the truth, I've learned, has a way of echoing louder than any accusation. The stage was set at the Four Seasons Grand Ballroom. My father arrived in a sharp navy suit, smiling confidently, shaking hands with investors, his laughter a little too loud. Cameras were everywhere, the press eagerly awaiting the big merger announcement. He absolutely thrived on this kind of attention. Meanwhile, Marcia and I were in a reserved room next to the ballroom with the compliance panel and several board members. Lena, my father's assistant, paced in a corner, clutching her notes, her nerves completely frayed. I took a deep breath, focusing on keeping it steady. Despite the medical monitors hidden under my clothes, despite the lingering weakness in my ribs, I felt a strange sense of calm. The panel chair, a composed woman named Avery Chun, looked over the documents one last time. She turned to me and asked, "Isabella, are you emotionally ready for this?" I just nodded. I'm not here to punish anyone, I told her. I'm here to protect what's right. Marcia gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze. And that's why this will work, she whispered. The meeting began with a round of applause as my father took the stage. His voice was smooth, carrying that familiar blend of confidence, control, and charm. Thank you all for coming, he began. Today marks the beginning of a new era for Hayes Global Health. But then Avery stepped onto the stage beside him. Before we proceed, she announced into the microphone, we need to address some concerns raised during the preliminary review. My father's smile tightened at the edges. Concerns? He asked. Yes, Avery said calmly. Regarding internal procedures, financial reporting, and the medical directives involving your family. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. My father shot her a look, the kind that used to silence entire departments. Those matters are private, he said, his voice low and threatening. Actually, Avery replied, her tone unwavering, not when they intersect with executive authority and company governance. She signaled to the tech booth. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly. I saw my father's eyes widen in alarm. Stop, he barked. Turn that off. But it was too late. The recording started to play. His voice, my own father's voice, filled the massive ballroom. Let her pass. We're not paying for that surgery. The room erupted in gasps, stunned silence, and frantic whispers. Investors froze in their seats. Board members stood up. Camera flashes started going off like lightning. He tried to talk over the recording. This is taken out of context. But Avery just raised a hand. There's more, she said. The recording continued, his tone now clinical, cold, completely detached. Financially, her death clarifies the situation. Restore the inheritance access clause. And then he froze. For the very first time in my life, my father looked small. A board member stood up, his voice booming. Robert, did you sign a DNR for your daughter without consulting medical ethics or legal counsel? The whispers in the ballroom turned into a roar. Another executive demanded, where were the compliance checks? Why were these red flags ignored? My father's voice finally cracked under the pressure. This is an invasion of privacy. You have no idea what. Avery cut him off sharply. We also reviewed inconsistencies in financial allocations associated with the foundation. Until those are formally audited, this merger cannot proceed. Flashbulbs went off in a frenzy. Reporters leaned forward, scribbling furiously. Investors were already on their phones, stepping out of the room with urgent expressions. In less than a single minute, the merger my father had worshipped, the one he had sacrificed everything for, completely crumbled. He gripped the podium as if the whole room was spinning around him. You can't do this, he whispered, defeated. We're not doing anything, Avery replied, her voice clear and firm. The evidence speaks for itself. After the meeting imploded, security guided my father to a private room. The news spread like wildfire. The board had called an emergency vote. He had no idea I was in that room until he turned and saw me. I was sitting quietly, wrapped in a shawl, breathing carefully. His eyes filled with something I had never seen in them before. It wasn't guilt, and it wasn't love. It was pure, unadulterated shock. You're awake, he stammered. Yes, I said softly. He started rambling. You don't understand, Isabella. This was all a misunderstanding. I was trying to protect the company. I interrupted him, my voice gentle but firm. Dad, I'm not here to argue with you. The board will handle everything. His jaw clenched. You think you've won? Tears welled up in my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of clarity. There's no winning, I said. Not in this, he shot back. You've ruined this family. I just shook my head. You did that long before today, he staggered back as if my words were a physical blow. I slowly stood up, steadying myself. Dad, I didn't expose any of this to hurt you. I exposed it because people deserve to know the truth. And because you tried to leave me with no voice at all. And for the first time in our entire lives, he was speechless. He had no words. By that evening, the board had voted unanimously to remove him as CEO, pending a full investigation. The merger was suspended indefinitely. The foundation was placed under an independent audit. And the DNR he signed for me was formally reported for an ethics review. As for me, I returned to the hospital completely exhausted, but finally breathing freely. Lena visited me that night. She just crawled onto the spare bed in my recovery suite and whispered, "I'm so proud of you." I reached out and held her hand. "We're going to be okay," I told her. She nodded. "He won't be." I closed my eyes, my voice barely a whisper. "That's his journey now. Not ours." 2 months later, I was standing on the rooftop garden of my apartment, watching the sunset shimmer on the lake. My ribs had healed. My strength had returned. And my mother's trust, the inheritance she left me, was safe, exactly where she intended it to be. I wasn't the same person I was before the accident. I was stronger. I was clearer. I was unshakable. And the lesson I learned through all of this: some people love power more than they love family. But in the end, integrity will always outlast both. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found a piece of your own strength in it, please subscribe for more.